I had the most prolific reading month this year, and as you can see, I read a lot on my physical TBR. Hello, my name is Emily Crow from The Cozy Crow, and welcome to my YouTube channel. If you can hear Alfred, he is currently on my lap, purring up a storm. It's kind of cold today, and I was living today underneath a blanket, but I have emerged to film this video, and I will go right back to cozying under a blanket when I am done talking to you about everything that I read in the month of October. First, we'll start off with my stats that I've got here in my notebook. So I said this is a really big reading month. I read 20 books total, which is the most books I've read in a month this entire year. And I wasn't necessarily trying to hit a number until I was like maybe 2 to 3 days out from the end of the month, and I realized I was really close to hitting 20. I thought that would be really great. But for most of the month, I was just reading because I was having a grand old time. When looking at my stats for how I read my books, I read 14 books on audio. I use the Libby app mostly, but I do have Hoopla. I just feel like their selection is not as inclusive as the selection for Libby. I also read 3 ebooks, which is more than I usually do, though at least one of them was really, really short. But I did get a lot of ebook reading done. And then I read 3 physical books, which makes sense. I don't read a ton of physical books, but I'm really surprised actually that I got through 3 of them. Though I did have 2 novellas that I read physically, so those were quicker reads for sure. And then when we look at the books in my physical TBR, when I say physical TBR, I just mean all the physical copies of books that I have not yet read. And I was able to get 15 books off of my physical TBR this month, meaning I did a lot of audiobooks and even ebooks to kind of read through some of these books in my physical TBR because I work through audiobooks way faster than physical books just in this stage of my life, and I really enjoy audiobooks. And so sometimes I'll do a library audiobook to get through a book on my physical TBR shelf. And that's a lot of what happened this month. So I had 15 books that I was able to get off of my physical TBR shelf. It's actually 16 books because I had 15 books that I read and 1 book that I ended up unhauling, DNFing. I talked about it last month in my video that the nonfiction book about some contemporaries to Jane Austen in Great Britain, it was just not holding my attention and I didn't want to read it. I DNF'd. I really don't DNF a lot of books, but because I had a physical copy of that book that I bought from a secondhand store, I unhauled it and it is now off of my shelf, which feels like a weight lifted. Tells me that that was the right thing to do. Let's take a look at the genres that I read this month. And I know there's a lot of books that fall into multiple genres. I tried to categorize for this segment of my statistics which genre I felt that book fit in the most, maybe why I was reading it, or the major plot points and whether it was fantasy versus romance. I did not have a separate section for romantasy. As far as all the books that I read 6 romances, I read 7 fantasies, I read 4 mysteries, which is more than I usually do, but it was spooky month, 'tis the season. I read 2 horrors, and I also read 1 nonfiction, which I am doing more recently than I used to if you look at the beginning of the year versus more currently. The longest book that I read this month is in this pile. Can you guess what it is? It is Kingdom of Ash by Sarah J. Maas because it is nearly 1,000 pages. It is 984 pages per Storygraph. And then the shortest book that I read, I had a few shorter books this month, but the shortest, according to Storygraph, was Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark that I read on ebook, and that is only 128 pages, so that was a pretty quick read. And I can't remember the author, Alvin. I have my notebook in front of me. Why am I trying to pull this out of my brain? Alvin Schwartz. There we go. Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark by Alvin Schwartz, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. I also like to look at when these books were published. It just educates me on like my reading interests and whether or not I'm going and reading backlisted books or whether I'm reading more contemporary books that are popular right now. I read 5 books that were published in 2024. I read 5 books published in 2023, 3 books that were published in the early 2020s, 4 books published in the 2010s. I read 1 book in the aughts, 2000 to 2009. I read 1 book published in the 1980s, and I thought that was my oldest book, which was silly because my oldest book was actually published in the 1930s in 1937. And that one was Death on the Nile by Agatha Christie. I should have known. Of course, that was the oldest book I read, but I kind of forgot. The book in the 1980s though, which one was that one? Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, I think, was published in the 80s. It is an older book for sure. Now that we've talked about my statistics for what I read in the month of October, let's jump into all the books that I read. I'll tell you about them and my ratings. And I need to rearrange my books again. I always list them from earliest read in the month, and then I just stack all the way to the last I read in the month. And I need to flip them around so I can pull things down from the stack and share with you what I read. You'll also notice that I finished my mini bookshelf. I did a workshop at Poppy's Books and Gifts in Spanish for Utah, and we started this project, but I had to leave kind of earlier than I intended. We were doing some kid shuffling for my daughter, getting her where she needed to be. And so I finally sat down and I finished on one of the late nights I stayed up prepping for night shift. I finished putting together all my books, and they didn't give us this many books to decorate in the workshop. I went and bought more books, and I put more books on my bookshelf. So that is nice and stashed. I'll probably leave it up here, but maybe I'll find a better spot for it. The first book that I finished in the month of October was The Blast from the Past by Lucy Score. And this is the third book in a, how do I say it? Like a romantic comedy, paranormal mystery. It's a really interesting blend of genres that's just a riot. It's so funny. It's just kind of ridiculous and funny, and it's just a really good comfort read. I really enjoyed this series. It's the Riley Thorne series, and I think the fourth book came out earlier this year. Originally, the first three were published maybe independently, or they had like older covers and they were republished, and now the fourth book has come out, which is really exciting. So I have that on deck to read soon. And I can't give away too much because I don't want to spoil some of the things alluded to in prior books, but basically someone who's missing is found, but they are not as they seem, and Riley and Nick are trying to figure out what's truly going on. I didn't like this book as much as the other books in the series, but I still had such a fun and goofy time. I rated this a 4.25 star. You still get all of the shenanigans and the laughter and sometimes some more adult content type of jokes, but I had a really fun time. I just felt like the characters, if you compare the beginning of this book to the end of this book, didn't really change or grow throughout the book at all. They felt kind of stagnant, which is not my favorite, but I also love these characters. And maybe there was like a little smidgen of growth in, you know, some relationships, but overall, they just felt like the same exact people. And I do like some character growth in my stories. So not my favorite, but still definitely a really good comfort read for me, and I'm excited to read the next one. The next book that I read was Where the Dark Stands Still by A.B. Poranek. And this is a YA dark fairy tale that is inspired by some Polish folk tales, which was really cool. I don't know any Polish folk tales off the top of my head, and so it was really interesting to dive into this world and become acquainted with it. I feel like if I read this book again, I would get more out of it because the story was so entrenched in those folk tales that were totally new to me. I also really liked this dark fairy tale type of vibe that was threaded throughout the book, and I really loved the character growth that I saw and the relationships between characters and how they developed. There is a romance that is honestly secondary to the relationships changing between these characters. I feel like if the romance wasn't in there at all, I would have liked this a little bit more. I rated this a 4.25 star as well, but I still really enjoyed it, and it opened my mind to folktales I had never known about, and it makes me want to learn more about some Polish folktales and to broaden what I know about that, which I think is really cool. As far as the plot goes, there is a young girl who has threads of magic, and she has caused some accidents to happen because she doesn't know how to control her magic. So she attempts to gain a wish or gain a favor so that she can ask a mysterious demon type creature to take away her magic for her. She ends up getting captured in the forest while she's on this little quest, and she's being held by this demon type figure for a year in his home, and then at the end of that year she'll be released and her wish will be granted. I really loved learning about these characters, and I loved seeing how the story kind of progressed. If you like the idea of like a dark fairy tale type of Polish folklore, I think you would really love this. Though I don't know how this compares to more traditional folktales, how much of this story was based in traditional folktales versus a deviation from it or an extrapolation or what, I'm not sure. But I really enjoyed it with my limited experience in Polish folktales, so I definitely recommend it. The next book that I read on audio, I got through lots of audiobooks at the very beginning of this month that I didn't have on my TBR, but I read the fourth and final book in the Natural series by Jennifer Lynn Barnes, and this book is called Bad Blood. And it takes some of the plot twists at the end of book 3 and really heightens them. So there's a cult involved. They're kind of looking into Casey's past and her mother and things like that. And that's all I'm gonna say because there's a lot more that comes to light throughout this book. I found this to be a decent conclusion to the series. I rated this a 3.75 star, definitely not my favorite. I just felt like the plot for this book in particular was a little bit more all over the place and kind of hard to follow the point of what the author was doing through this book. And I felt like the ending was a bit rushed, like where the climax was in relation to the rest of the story, especially knowing that this is the fourth and final book in this series. I feel like there should have been a little bit more wrap up at the end. It also felt like Celine, which is a character that was introduced in this book, was introduced just to be able to like move the plot along. When she was a really interesting and I think a really important character, and I wish she had been introduced with more forethought or maybe introduced in previous books because I feel like she became a really important part of this team of teenagers that were working to solve crimes with the FBI in this secret program. There were tons of big reveals and plot twists and things that kept me on the edge of my seat the whole time I was reading this, so this was still a really fun read and it feels good to be able to finish a series. You can see like other books. My stack of books is getting way too high. I need to build the bookshelf that we are intending to put in here. We will get to that hopefully by the end of the year. The next book that I read was a new purchase that I bought in October, and I read in October, so that feels really good to be on top of my physical TBR like that. But this is Graveyard Shift by M.L. Rio, and I got the Barnes & Noble exclusive edition. It's got the, what's it called? Like the fold-over papers. And there's some extra content at the back, like books related to the characters in the story, like books that those characters would prefer. What else is there? I think there might be, oh yeah, there's a playlist. There might be like a cocktail recipe, I can't remember. I thought this would be so fun to read on a graveyard shift at my job. I am a nurse and I switch back and forth between days and night shifts, so I actually did. I brought this with me on a night shift and I read it. I didn't like this book as much as I thought I would. I rated this a 3.25 star. I was a bit disappointed in it because it's marketed as a horror and it was like not horror enough for me. I honestly like some really gruesome horror. Like I want to be shocked and disturbed, and this did not do that for me. I felt like there was just like a little sprinkle of horror in this story and I wanted a lot more. It's definitely atmospheric and it's like slightly creepy, but yeah, not what I was looking for. I also felt like this plot didn't really go anywhere. There was like one big reveal kind of in the middle of the story, and then we didn't really get much else plot-wise or like any interesting thoughts of like how the story was progressing. Just that one moment, kind of in the middle of the story. And I didn't necessarily like how the story was written in that way. I honestly really liked the characterization of these characters. They were all very distinct and they were introduced in a really clear way at the beginning of the story. And I did really appreciate that, but then we didn't see hardly any character growth or really anything else added to these characters throughout the book. Maybe a little bit in like one or two of the characters, but yeah, not as much of the character arcs that I was kind of hoping to see either. And I think that with a novella, it's hard to have that depth of plot and that depth of story. I feel like M.L. Rio missed the mark a little bit. For me, it just was pretty mediocre in a lot of ways. It actually reminded me a lot of What Moves the Dead, by T. Kingfisher, except that T. Kingfisher literally made me like nauseous. But a lot of the premises of the story and as things are coming to light, that's kind of what it reminded me of, and it had kind of a similar feel, but I think that T. Kingfisher does it a lot better. I will definitely say that with the well-written characters and the really beautiful writing, that I do think this is still worth reading, but it definitely was not what I was looking for in a horror, and not as strong of a story as it should have been. Maybe another reason this reminds me of T. Kingfisher's, because can you look at that? There's like a rat with fungi growing on him. That's familiar. And now, Kingdom of Ash by Sarah J. Maas. This huge tome took me months. I think I started it in July, and I had both the ebook and the audiobook from Audible, and I switched back and forth between both methods of reading. I was not going to haul around a 1,000-page book to read like in my bed or whatever. And while I did read a significant chunk of this book ebook wise, I classified this as an audiobook because I definitely read more in the audiobook category, and I really would not have finished this anytime soon if I hadn't like spent a couple days just listening to this on audiobook to get like 400 or 500 pages done. Some people say this is their favorite of the series. I will say it's not my favorite of the series. There's some reasons for that, but I also still really enjoyed this book, and I rated it a 4.5 star. I really loved it. I really love these characters, and that you got a lot about each one of them, and you got to see how their stories concluded individually as well as together. For the most part, Dorian and Manon, I feel like, was kind of a thread left undone. I kind of understood where the author ended their story in this book, but I just feel like I wanted more, because those were a couple of my favorite characters. Yeah, it felt a little unfinished for their individual stories and their relationship together. I just wanted more information. I also feel like this book should not have been 1,000 pages long. There's definitely stuff that happens, but I feel like the author was so particular about sharing every person's story that this book just got really, really long. And it didn't necessarily feel like it was too long because I was getting to read everybody's points of views and all the things they were doing, but it feels a little ridiculous to have a book this long. I do not know how much time she spent in writing all these words down. I am thoroughly like a 200 to 400 page book reader. Like, that's what I really enjoy as far as a length and my attention span. This was hard to get through because it was so long, even though I enjoyed picking it up every time I did. I felt like the build up to the conclusion happening in this book was so big over so many books of the series that I guess I was expecting a little bit more of a climax in this book. It felt like the conclusion of how things turned out just happened a little too simply and a little too quickly. And that's something that I said for Sky Beyond the Storm by Sabaa Tahir, the fourth and final book in the An Ember in the Ashes series, that it just felt like the climax got resolved too easily and too quickly for all the stress and buildup over multiple books in the series that you knew something was going to happen. It just was a little bit unsatisfying because I wanted a little bit more turmoil and strife in the moment of the climax. And I wanted things to work out not quite as well as they did. Maybe it's because I grew up reading Harry Potter and Deathly Hallows is a lot emotionally, but I was expecting more death in this book. And I did not get as much death and devastation in that final battle. Was I hoping for some of my favorite characters to be killed off? Maybe, just for a little bit more balance. I'm not holding this book up anymore because my arm is tired. I still really enjoyed the Throne of Glass series. I could see myself rereading it and still enjoying it a lot. It's a very easy to read series, partly because it starts out in kind of like the YA new adult genre, but also just the way that Sarah J. Maas writes is very readable and easy to binge. It's not like you need all your cylinders firing in your brain in order to understand what's happening in the books. So even though this series is very long, has many pages, I would recommend it as like an easy fantasy series to get into if you're interested in that. I know I mentioned that I finished off the Natural series by reading Bad Blood, and while that is technically true, there is a novella that has been published that is like an after story to the original series, and this is called 12, and it actually involves a small child that was featured in an earlier book that they were able to rescue in helping the FBI. It's been like 6 years or something. So now she's 12 years old and she is threatening to end her life. I'm trying to think of a good way to say this. She's threatening to end her life because she feels like no one is listening to her and she feels that there is a killer on the loose that needs to be stopped. Like I said, this is a novella. It's a pretty quick read, like kind of finish it in one day kind of thing. And you get to see all of these characters in the Naturals program grown up, working for the FBI as a consultant or going to school, getting educated so that they can continue to use their skills to solve crimes. And so that was kind of fun to see them in the future, but I felt like these characters were kind of exactly the same as they were 6 years in the past or 5 years in the past, wherever we are along the timeline. So even though they were all in their early 20s, they still felt exactly the same. That was a little bit disappointing. I would have loved to see some growth, and understandably they did feel very similar, but it felt like no time had passed. I rated this a 3.5 star. I found that in such a small story in this novella that there weren't a lot of possible culprits. You know, it has to be someone that is introduced in the story. And so the plot was a little bit more simple and quick to resolve than in longer lengths of books. In general, I like this story. It was fun to keep reading about these people, but it wasn't the best in the series. I feel like if you like this series a lot, the Natural series, then you will still enjoy reading this book, but it's definitely not necessary if you're just indifferent about these characters. The next book that I read was Death on the Nile by Agatha Christie, and I really love this cover. I think the colors are beautiful, and it's just really fun. I have seen the movie already, so maybe that ruined it a little bit for me because I already had an idea of what would happen. But last year I read Halloween Party by Agatha Christie, which is another Hercule Poirot book. That is really hard to say. Oh my goodness. And I did not like that one very much. There was a lot of like racism and discrimination, and it just got kind of annoying to keep reading these things like they were beating a dead horse. But this book I liked a little bit more. There was definitely some of that systemic discrimination, but not nearly as much as in Halloween Party. So I like that. I also like the setting. I thought it was interesting. I do feel like it was hard to follow the characters. There's so many characters introduced at the very beginning of this book, and it was really hard to differentiate them and keep track of how these characters were all related. So that was something I didn't enjoy as much. And I don't know if that's just the writing style or this particular book or what. This book I rated a 4-star. I feel like I may still read another Hercule Poirot story. I'm still not quite sure how I feel about them. It's a classic detective story. Maybe I'll read, what is it? The Haunting in Venice is the third movie that's come out recently, but I have not seen that one. So maybe that one would be a good one to read. Third time's a charm, and I can decide whether I want to keep reading Hercule Poirot books or whether I need to move on to more modern mysteries that are more contemporary. And I think that with books like this that have some outdated and discriminatory speech in here, it's important to remember the time period that these books were written in to give some context for what's happening. And I feel like it's important to have discussions about the author's biases and the inappropriate thoughts that they had about other people. What do I want to say? That even though there are issues, politically incorrect things in this book, I feel like it's important to still have discussions about books like these so that we can learn from even the mistakes of people in the past, rather than just forgetting about books like this and only reading books that have appropriate viewpoints, if that makes sense. Reading is an educational experience, and even in examining the biases of authors and of certain time periods and understanding more the links between the past and the present and how we set about doing good in the world, I feel like it's more poignant if we analyze past works and talk about them rather than just sweeping them under the rug. Are my personal viewpoints on that. That's why I don't believe in banned books. But that is a whole nother discussion that we are not getting into. But if you want to go into that, let me know down below and maybe I'll make a video talking about my views on banned books. The next book I read was another novella, and I rated this a 4-star as well. I enjoyed it for a lot of reasons, but there were other ways that it wasn't quite my favorite. But this is Camera Chemistry by Chelsea Curto, and this is number 1 in a series of photography-inspired romances. It's indie published, and I picked up this novella at the Book Box, which is a semi-local bookstore to me. It's in Draper, Utah, I think. I really enjoyed a lot of things about this book. I liked how the characters were intelligent and professional and had built lives. They were older. I think they were in their 30s. Maybe he was even in his 40s, so they were clearly adults, and they clearly acted like adults, which I really appreciated. Neither of them had perfect bodies, but they still had a lot of chemistry and appreciation for one another in their like imperfect perfectness, if that makes sense. In this story, the two love interests are kind of wrangled into doing a stranger photo shoot by their friends, and there's some instant chemistry on camera in their photographs. Things get a little bit steamy, and they decide, let's see where this chemistry goes and do kind of like a one-night stand weekend type of scenario. The things I didn't like about this book is it's very like adult physical relationship focused, and I do like some spice in my books. But this was like every single chapter for like 75% of the book had spice in it, and it was just like tiring to read about. I was like, I want to read about more emotional connection. There wasn't necessarily anything wrong with the spice. Like there were a couple moments that were like a little bit cringe, but in general, I just got tired of how much spice there was in this book, and there really wasn't a lot of plot. And granted, it is a novella, but I really wanted them to show not just their like chemistry and connection, but also like show it emotionally too. Like you could tell it was there, and I just wanted more of the emotional aspect of this relationship rather than hearing so much about the physical aspect of the relationship. But I really enjoyed these characters. I loved the way they interacted in their relationship as it was developing, and I just wanted more of the emotional side and not so much of the spicy stuff because it just got old. It was constantly spicy. I've thought about picking up the next book in this series because in general I did really like this, but from what I've read, the rest of the series is also extremely spice heavy, like constant spice, and I'm not looking for a constant spice type of a romance, honestly, and so I'm gonna be reading some other things instead, I think. But I would recommend this, and if this sounds like the kind of book that you would like, I think that's great. I don't think I want to read another book that is majority spicy scenes. I want something more emotionally driven, I think. The next book that I read was Love Theoretically by Hazelwood, and some people love this. Some people have said this is their favorite Hazelwood book. I rated this a 3.75 star. It's not my first Hazelwood. I read her YA that came out, like Chess and Mate, I think. Check and Mate? Oh man, what's it called? I think it's called Check and Mate. I read that book, and I read Bride by Hazelwood, and I think that she's just not like a favorite romance for me. I'm just not totally on board. It's not scratching the itch that I would hope for, but it's still a pretty good book. I will say though that I really wanted to DNF this multiple times in the first like 25% of this book, and I think it just took me a while to really get used to this female protagonist. She just really grated on me. I was kind of annoyed by her. But this book is about Elsie, who is trying to become a theoretical physics researcher, and she's kind of stuck in an adjunct professor position. She's feeling kind of stuck. She can barely afford her insulin. She's diabetic, and she's just not in a great spot, and she's really hoping that she can fill a position that just opened up at like MIT, and it's like her dream job. She's really hoping for it. And then the male protagonist, she comes to find out, actually has met her before and has been kind of suspicious of how she portrays herself. And you learn more about how they interact and get to know each other more. Yeah, I just was really bugged by her. It was really clear that there were tons of people manipulating her and taking advantage of her, and she was so much of a people pleaser that she just let them walk all over her. And that was just really hard to read and really frustrating for me. And maybe it's because I'm not a people pleaser. Maybe people pleasers really like hearing that perspective, but I just got really annoyed at her for being really stupid about how she was interacting with other people. And not just in like small ways, but like advisor was being really manipulative. her family, like her brothers and her mom that you hear about. And I just really didn't like it. It made me feel uncomfortable and it made me not like this main character. It also felt like her sense of humor was a little bit immature, not like crude sense, but like she came off really, really young and naive. And I know that added to her characterization, but it just made me continue to not like her as much. Once I kind of got into the book, I really enjoyed it and I kept reading as I was seeing the relationship between these two progress. But I also felt like she was ignoring the big issue that was bugging her. Every time she thought about it, she's like, but I won't think about that now, and just moved on and then just forgot about it purposefully. And then when it came to a head and she had to actually deal with it, she was all affronted because of this issue when she could have resolved it way sooner. And I didn't really like this character. Can you tell? I did like him as a character and I felt like she misunderstood and misinterpreted him. So maybe that's another reason why I was just like, come on, Elsie. Not my favorite. I think I may end up reading another Hazelwood in the future, but none of her books have been huge hits for me. So maybe I'll just take a break and cut my losses and say that she's just not the right kind of romance author for me. The next book that I read, one that I've really been waiting for, this is Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. And when these books are like 600 pages, it's really hard to get through physically. So I did this on audio and it might not look 600 pages, but the pages are really thin, honestly. Not like Bible thin, but getting there for sure compared to the other books that I have on my shelves. I really enjoyed this book. It's like a 26-hour audiobook read, so it's definitely a long one. My first Brandon Sanderson was Tress of the Emerald Sea, and I love that book. I wanted to get into his Cosmere, and Mistborn is the place to start from what I've read. I really like how this book is well balanced in all sorts of aspects of both plot points and like the story, how it's going on, but also different elements of like romance and adventure and heists and mysteries and things like that. I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I really like the characters. I really like their characterization and how the characters grew throughout this book. This book kind of reminded me of Dune, actually. And maybe it's because at the beginning of each chapter, there's like a little excerpt that you read, but also just maybe the way that Kelsier is portrayed kind of reminds me of the Messiah type of character. And it was just really intriguing and interesting, and I really loved being in this world. Maybe it started a little bit slow, but it was so interesting of a world and of a magic system that I didn't feel like it was slow at all. It was just really intriguing. I also feel like the magic system in here is really unique, really intricate, but very approachable, which is really cool. I feel like there's a really good balance. I'm really excited to read the next book. I rated this a 5-star, but I have like 8 more weeks or 10 more weeks left on my library book hold. So that's kind of sad. I'm not gonna get to reading the next book physically before that point. So I'm just gonna suck it up and wait anxiously for my Libby hold to come through. The next book that I read was an ebook, and this was Till There Was You. This book is by Lindsay Hameroff, and I did get this book from my library. I adore this cover, like probably the cutest cover of this entire month. This book fell short for me. I rated this a 3.25 star. I really like the premise. The girl has this goal to become a Michelin star chef, and the boy has a goal to be a singer-songwriter, and they meet when they are just barely starting on these paths of success for themselves, and they have a whirlwind weekend and have some chemistry, and then they never see each other again, and she's heartbroken. He skyrockets to fame and ends up writing a song about her blueberry pancakes. And a while later, they run into each other again, and you see this relationship be rekindled. I did really like the premise of this story, and I really liked the meet cute and the chemistry they had. They didn't have amazing chemistry, but they had some good chemistry. So I was like, yeah, sure, I'm on board with this. Let's see where this goes. But then after like the first 20% of this book, I just got really frustrated with these characters. It felt like neither of them were in a space where they could have an adult relationship. They both acted kind of immature, and there was a lot of like jealousy and like trying to prove themselves. It just felt kind of weird the way that they were like trying to interact, and I didn't really get any chemistry after that first meet cute. I also felt like they both had so many personal trials and struggles that they were not in a good spot for a relationship. You see them overcome a little bit in the book, but I am not convinced that they will stay together at the end of this book, and that's not good for a romance. Other people have really liked it, thought it was really cute. I had a hard time with these characters. Their flaws were just so blaring and made me have a really hard time believing in the relationship. So I rated this a 3.25 star because there's some things I enjoyed with like the premise. I do like when characters have some faults too, but I feel like this book took it way too far and things just did not get resolved in a way that was satisfying, that I feel like things will work out for this couple in the end. I really don't think so. They were just too immature and not ready to handle any fame, stardom, success, and tackle their own personal issues. Maybe 3.25 is a little bit too high of a rating, but kind of 3-star is my thought that I kind of like this as much as I didn't like it, if that kind of puts it into context. So it was pretty much on the nose. Like, I liked it slightly more than I didn't like it, but only slightly. Alfred, don't knock over my pile of books. Alfred! Get out of here. Ugh. The next book that I read was The 7-Year Slip by Ashley Poston, and I read The Dead Romantics last year, and I really enjoyed it. Was that last year? Anyway, it doesn't even matter. I recently read another book by Ashley Poston, and I really enjoyed The Dead Romantics. For The 7-Year Slip, I didn't enjoy it quite as much as The Dead Romantics, but I still enjoyed it. I rated this a 4.25 star. The thing I love about Ashley Poston's books is that she combines romance and navigating grief really, really well. And I love having that dynamic within these characters. In this book, Clementine, the female main character, is grieving the loss of her aunt, and she has inherited the apartment that her aunt lived in. And this apartment, apparently, she hears, can go back in time 7 years in the past. And it does this kind of randomly. Clementine thinks this is just like a cutesy thing that her aunt said, but then one day she finds a strange man in her apartment. Come to find out, her aunt subletted it to him, even though her aunt is dead. And so she finds out that this is in fact true, that she has hopped back in time 7 years in this apartment and meets this guy. What's his name? Ewan? It's hard to remember. I read this on audio so long ago, but it's like I-W-A-N. Ewan, something like that. And he is actually a beginning chef and has a passion for cooking. I really love their chemistry as they were getting to know each other and how things just grew really organically. But she goes back and forth between like hopping back to her time and kind of navigating the struggles that she's facing there with navigating grief, navigating her job that's maybe not bringing her the joy that it used to, and trying to help out her publishing house. She works for a publisher. And then hopping back in time to spend time with this guy that she is slowly falling for. So I really like that part of the story. I do feel like, though, the way this story wrapped up didn't wrap up as much as I would have liked. There wasn't a lot of closure as far as like this apartment goes and how these characters grew. And when Clementine meets Ewan in the current time frame, I just feel like I didn't see enough growth in his character over the 7 years. He just seemed like a completely different person in the current timeline compared to 7 years ago, and I wanted a little bit more connection between those characters, especially because that was something that Clementine was nervous about, because she felt like she didn't know him like she did 7 years ago in his past. I just felt like things were a little bit left unsaid that I wanted to have said and clarified, especially with a magical realism type of a book. I do want some clarity about what's happening, even if there's not a good reason why this apartment does what it does. I was definitely feeling burnt out on romances because I read a few right in a row and none of them were really having my heart. And so I took a break and I read some other things. The next book that I read was Everyone on This Train is a Suspect by Benjamin Stevenson. And this is the second book in a mystery series, definitely a comedic mystery series that breaks down the fourth wall. So it's a really fun read where the narrator, Ernest, is writing down his story of the murder or murders that happened, and also giving you hints at like, pay attention to this thing, or on such and such a page, you're gonna see the second murder, because he writes fair play mysteries rely on certain rules or tips and tricks that authors follow. And so he points those things out, which is really fun and funny to read. The murderer was mentioned like 162 times in this book. Like the murderer's name was said that many times, or things like that that just break the fourth wall. It makes it a really fun reading experience. I did the audiobook for this as well. I read the audio for most of these books. I did not like this as much as the first book in the series, which is Everyone in My Family Has Killed Someone. I just felt like the thickness of the plot and the red herrings and like just the complications of everything happening in the first book was a lot more interesting than this book. Everyone is on a train, and so there's, you know, less places to go. There's a lot more talking to one another and learning about what's happening and trying to figure out based on what people reveal who has motive and what's really going on despite all the secrets people aren't sharing. Which actually kind of reminds me of Death on the Nile as more of like a talking book rather than like a finding clues type of a book. And that's how this felt, though I did still really enjoy it. Ernest, though, is kind of depressed, midlife crisis. He's just kind of a sad sack in this book, and it's not as fun to read about. Granted, the first book was kind of traumatic for him, so I guess it makes sense, but it just wasn't fun to read about a character who was just kind of in a bleh mood the whole book. So we'll see. I will definitely read another book in this series. If another one is written, we'll see if his attitude changes. If I can enjoy his personality a little bit more in the next book. But if you're looking for a comedic murder mystery that is more intricate than a cozy mystery, then I think this could be a good book for you. The next book that I read was actually my least favorite of the entire month, and this is Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark by Alvin Schwartz. This is like a middle grade book, but with that in mind, I still didn't really like this book. I remembered reading some of these stories when I was young, and there are some moments that have stuck in my brain this whole time, and I haven't forgotten them. And so I was like, ooh, wow, like if they made that much of an impact on me when I was little, like let's see like how scary and horrific those things are to me now as an adult. And I've gone back and read some childhood books as an adult, and this one did not hold up like other books have for me. Honestly, the illustrations were way scarier than the content of the book itself. So that was kind of disappointing. The illustrations are really, really good. I just didn't even get like creeped out at all, like zero sense of being horrified. So that was really disappointing. I did like how this author at the end shares where all of these tales come from, because they all are based in American folklore, which is really cool. I found that neat. So that's why I rated this a 3-star and not less, because there's like a historical aspect to all these stories, and I really liked getting a little bit of that insight, and these illustrations are amazing. But this was not a horror book. Maybe if you are 10, you would like this book as a scary book. I felt zero feelings about this book, and I wanted a little bit of feelings. The next book that I read in the month of October was House of Sky and Breath by Sarah J. Maas, and this is the second book in the Crescent City series. This is an urban fantasy with lots of adult topics and a very casual way of speaking that doesn't feel like a fantasy. So like lots of swearing and like crude comments and things. Lots of adult topics brought up in a very casual way. The thing that makes this a fantasy is that the main character is half fae, and her love interest is an angel type of character, a dark angel maybe you could say. They're in this fantasy world with a lot of parallels to our world, hence urban fantasy, but a high urban fantasy for sure. In this book, these characters are again trying to solve a mystery that is, surprise, surprise, somehow connected to Danica, their friend that died at the very beginning of the first book in the series. And I rated this a 4.75 star. I really enjoyed it. Urban fantasy is not my favorite genre. Like I don't really like the setting. I also don't like how casual and adult a lot of the things are discussed in this book. It's just like not my favorite, but I love the mystery that is included in this book, how things are woven together. There's definitely some red herrings and there's some interesting plot twists. I love the progression of the plot. Feels like things are constantly happening, and I can't put this book down. I really had a good time reading this. The only problem is the very end of this book, the big plot twist links this back to the Agatha series. And I haven't read Agatha, so now I have to put this series down to read Agatha so I can get the most out of book 3 of Crescent City. And that is a huge bummer to lose my momentum in this series, but I really feel like it's gonna make a difference in understanding what's going on with these characters, because it's not just like an Easter egg. You are directly roped into what happened in at least the Agatha series. We're going to pivot, read Agatha, and then come back and read Crescent City 3. The next book that I read, ripped my heart out, The Ballad of Never After by Stephanie Garber. This is the Barnes & Noble exclusive edition cover. It's so cute, I love it. This book, what do I even say? I really like how Evangeline, our main character, as she's trying to figure out how to help Apollo and navigate her relationship with Jax, when she keeps being drawn to him, but she feels used by him. I like how these different plot points kind of ebbed and flowed throughout the book and were constantly changing. It felt like things were always happening in this book. I also really like how Evangeline finally, at the end of this book, was setting some boundaries and speaking really clearly with Jax. I really like that. How she had some good character growth. But then the ending ripped my heart out. I was expecting some things, but some things totally blew me away. And I honestly feel devastated. And I am both anxious to pick up the third book, but also really scared to pick up the third book in the series, which is the final book of this trilogy. This romance is a huge slow burn. I've heard that people love this book, that this is their favorite in the series. I'm hoping I like the third book and how the series comes to a conclusion, but we shall see. The next book that I read was Weyward by Emilia Hart, which I thought would be the perfect fall read. And honestly, it is a really good fall read, really atmospheric, fall, autumnal type of vibes in this book. This book follows 3 different women from the same lineage in different time periods, drastically different time periods, and their connection to magic and how they are considered witches by the community that they live in. I did not like this book as much as I thought I would. I rated it a 3.5 star, and I think that my expectations were just not quite what this book is. This book is really tense, really melancholic, and for the first probably 65-70% of the book, I felt like anytime I was reading this that I was in the pit of despair. I didn't see any hope for any of these characters. I didn't see any joy, and it was just really hard to read. There's a lot of really triggering things related to physical, emotional, sexual assault in this book, and those were really hard to read, but just the overall tone was just really hard to read, and I found myself in a bad mood because I was reading this book and I had to take a little bit of a break for a couple days. But this book definitely made me feel a lot. And I liked seeing the character growth towards the end, how things kind of turned out in the end. I also feel like there's some value in books that talk about hard things and, feel difficult to read. But also the writing style was not my preferred writing style. I noticed when I was listening to the audiobook, things just felt kind of stilted. There was this weird juxtaposition of like sentences with beautiful prose that were really poetic, and then the next sentence would be really jagged and like jarring, honestly, very stilted. And so that wasn't my favorite writing too. So I rated this a 3.5 star. I really like the themes. I like learning about these characters. I generally like historical fiction, especially with some fantasy or magical elements. And I find value in telling stories like this, but it was really hard to read and not the mood that I am in right now. I do recommend this as a fall read if you feel like you're in the right headspace to read a book like this, but definitely check the trigger warnings. The next book that I read was The Rise and Fall of Dinosaurs by Steve Brusatte. And I really like this book. I rated it a 4.5 star. I am in my dino era. This is not the first nonfiction dinosaur book that I've read this year. And I've really enjoyed how this author combines both his active experience of being at dig sites or learning from other paleontologists with the dinosaurs themselves and the actual finds themselves. It was just a really interesting blend where I feel like his expertise and expertness in the field of paleontology really contributed to this book and to my experience reading this book. I do feel like I was lost in the trenches a little bit with the content of this book. It was not as easily approachable for someone without a paleontology background. So I would not recommend this as like your first experience nonfiction trying to read about dinosaurs, but it's also not so academic that you only should read this if you have a paleontology background. I feel like this is kind of a good middle ground if you want to dive in deeper with dinosaurs. In that it felt pretty approachable, but there was a lot of things I just did not understand. And like all the different dinosaur names that were brought up were not necessarily the dinosaurs that I know and love, but they were new finds and things like that. Also, blew my mind that birds are dinosaurs. Per the definition of what a dinosaur is, coming from a certain lineage of creatures, birds are dinosaurs. The next book that I read was an audiobook that I'm glad I didn't purchase though. Man, these romanticises with beautiful stenciled edges are really giving me a hard time because they look beautiful and then I read them and they are very mediocre and not worth spending $30 on a book. And it just makes me really sad that so many beautiful books are being published now that like the inside is not matching the beauty of the outside. Personally, don't come at me if you love these romanticises that are really easy to read, but like there's some things I really don't like about a lot of the contemporary romanticises I'm reading recently, and I really don't feel like it's my kind of genre. But this book, I think I'll read the second book. I don't want to buy it. I will wait for the library whenever this comes out. I am not in a hurry to continue this series. I liked this a little bit more than I disliked it, so I think I will keep reading. But this is The Wren in the Holly Library by K.A. Linde? I'm not sure. But this is a romantasy, like I said, that takes place in kind of a modern day world. Like they talk about New York and Chicago, but after monsters have overrun the world and now humans and monsters are living together in harmony after a treaty has been signed, though the humans are still not in a safe spot. They are still oppressed, they are still in poverty, etc., etc. Our main character is a thief, and she gets caught trying to steal something out of a monster's house. She didn't know it was a monster, or she wouldn't have even touched that with a 10-foot pole. But when she gets there, the monster is intrigued by her and wants her to work for him and steal something for him instead. And so she ends up moving in with him and getting a quite nice stipend and is training to be able to steal something from another monster. She takes this job because she feels like financially that's the best move that she can make for her and her little found family, her couple friends that she has. And you see the relationship between this monster and this thief grow. You see how you find out about magic that she has, and they try to understand what is going on with her magic because she's not a monster, but she's not human either. And you see them taking steps to prepare for this heist and uncover secrets, things like that. I found this was in general a pretty interesting story, and I really liked learning about what was going on because there was a few different elements that were kind of mixed together. There's a library in this monster's house, and I think his name is Graves, was sharing books with this thief in order for her to learn and prep academically for what she was stealing, because it was kind of an artifact found in some folktales kind of thing. The plot twist at the very end of this book was wild. I did not see it coming, but maybe I was thinking too casually while I was reading this book and I wasn't digging deep into what could be a plot twist, but it definitely took me by surprise, and I'm interested to see where this series is going. I don't know if it's going to be a duology or more than that. I did not like how this world was introduced. It felt like there were so many details missing and so many plot holes. Like, why in the world would the monsters, when they're overrunning the world, stop to sign a treaty to help out the humans when they could just overrun the whole world? Like, I don't know. Plot holes like that kind of bothered me because I was like, why did this even happen? I don't understand. Like, I need more details to provide meaning for what's happening because I don't buy it. I don't understand. I just feel like in general, the world building was really, really mediocre, and I didn't get a lot of world building and I needed more. I do feel like in general, there's just lots of plot holes throughout this story. And even in like the plot twist and like how things came to be, there was a little bit of, what is that, like Deus Ex Machina, that it just felt like things were working out. At the very end, there was this huge climax. There was no hope nothing good was gonna happen, and all of a sudden it was fine. Anyway, it just felt like too convenient a little bit. Kind of plot holes throughout this story. The romance wasn't my favorite. I didn't really get the chemistry, but I wasn't totally against the chemistry. I was just indifferent about it. This was fine, 3.25 star, very mediocre, but compared to other romanticities I've read this year, I liked it more than I didn't like it. So I think I'll read the next book. And the last book that I read in the month of October was Just for the Summer by Abby Jimenez, and this was my favorite book of the month. Yes, I had another 5-star read, but this 5-star beat out Mistborn. I love this book. I ended up reading the ebook for this, and I read it in like 4 days, which for a book this size as an ebook is amazing. Usually for an ebook, I'll read a couple chapters at night. For this book, I was like staying up late every single night to read as much as I could. I was not getting tired. I was really engaged in the story, and I just could not put this book down, which is the highest compliment that I could pay, especially for a book that I was reading as my bedtime routine, because usually those books take me forever to get through because I read them so slowly. So this book is about Emma and Justin. They both have their own kind of curse where person that breaks up with them ends up finding their soulmate immediately after dating Emma or Justin. And so as a joke, they kind of connect online and decide, haha, what if we dated and then we could kind of break the curse and both of us will find a soulmate. And they end up becoming friends. But she's a travel nurse and she decides to travel to Minnesota to him to test this out because she just feels like there's something more there. So she and her best friend go there. I really love the healthcare representation in Abby Jimenez's books, in the past couple books I've read of hers. And I really loved both of these characters. Justin was the sweetest. He was trying his hardest. He had a lot of inner turmoil because his mom is going to be leaving soon and he'll have to be the parent of his younger siblings, and so he's got a lot on his plate, and Emma's kind of his reprieve from that. And Emma has a lot of trauma from growing up, and she's found ways to cope, but not necessarily healthy ways to cope with all the trauma she's been through and her ways of navigating relationships with other people as a result. And so these characters are very flawed, but very lovable, and it's understandable why they are the way that they are. And you see them heal and grow and learn to love each other, and also learn to take time for themselves to try to heal their own inner demons, which I think was a beautiful touch. I also really there's a few cameos from characters in Part of Your World and yours truly that you see here too. And so things come a little bit full circle for these characters. I also feel like there were so many lines, especially that Emma said, that just were a punch to the gut, in a good way for me, that really made me stop to think. I loved her sense of empathy and caring, but also being detached from people. And that was a really interesting dichotomy that even if I'm not the same kind of person as her, I could totally understand. And part of that is because I'm a nurse, and part of that is because these characters are so well written. It was just such a good book. I really, really love this. This is my favorite Abby Jimenez that I've read so far. A meaningful read for me that made me stop and think about myself a lot and the way that I navigate the world in my imperfections. And I love these characters, and I loved how everything worked out in the end, and I loved the journey that these characters took along the way as well. All right, that is everything that I read in the month of October. All 20 books, so many. And this video is already really long, so I'm not going to talk about any TBR books or any books that I'm currently in the middle of reading. But if you want to see 10 books that I hope to read in the month of November, you can check out the short that I have listed on my channel. I'll try to link it down below for you as well. And let me know, have you read any of these books, or have you been convinced to read any of these books by me? I love sharing with you all the books that I have been reading, and I would love to hear from you down below so I can get some new book recs. All that being said, happy reading, and I'll see you next time. Bye!